Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be doing a build and review of Revell's 1/72nd scale Horten Geo 229. I was originally hoping to do this one for Model Minute's What If group build, but unfortunately I started a little bit late and did not have the time to finish it. But I've still put this little build video together and I hope you guys enjoy it. But without further ado, let's get into making this one. First of all, I gave all the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to clean any oil or residue from the parts, and then began to cut out the parts for the cockpit using my side cutters. Any excess sprue or flashing was carefully cleaned up using a knife and a little bit of sandpaper. I glued the cockpit floor to the upper fuselage, followed by the seat, instrument panel, and then the control column. I cut out the lower fuselage halves and various details for the cannon, which were then assembled and installed to the lower fuselage. I decided to modify this kit because sadly a lot of the details would be hidden, so I glued the ammunition box upside down so that at least the moulded shell casings would be visible via the underside panels. I cut out and assembled the framework that goes inside the nose wheel area, and after attaching the framework for the instrument panel, I cut out the wing halves, cleaned them up and then glued them together. With most of the interior assembly completed, I painted some XF24 dark grey onto the cockpit floor and walls, on the inside of the upper and lower fuselage halves, and also on the inside of the main landing gear bay. I carefully picked out the framework for the cockpit, the ammunition boxes, and the nose wheel bay with some XF22 RLM grey using a fine brush. The cannons were painted Vallejo 71072 gunmetal metallic, and for the details of the main cockpit frames, rudder pedals and metal wing ribs, I used some Vallejo Model Air 71063 RLM01 silver. To create some unpainted wooden areas, I applied some XF59 Desert Yellow onto certain areas of the upper and lower fuselage halves that would have been wood, and while that dried I painted Vallejo 70865 Oily Steel onto all of the engine exhausts and the fan blades while they were on the sprue. Several coats of all these paints would be applied to gradually make the colours uniform, while also avoiding creating brushstrokes from applying any of the layers on too thick. After the Desert Yellow was more solid, I then got out some Vallejo 70834 and 70828 wood grain paints and applied them together, blending them and applying several layers to create a wooden grain effect. Vallejo Vermilion Red and Flat Yellow were used to pick out some of the controls in the cockpit, and I added some extra Desert Yellow and wood grain to some of the areas in the cockpit. The wood and grain paints were built up in multiple layers, and in between coats I painted the cockpit headrest with Vallejo Saddle Brown, added the decal for the instrument panel, and glued the cockpit framework once I'd painted it into place. Eventually I was happy with the wooden grain and dry brushed some XF59 to add some highlights and help blend the wooden textures together before doing some final smaller streaks with the darker wooden grain colour. Initially, I glued the wing ribs to the lower fuselage, but I would later move them to make them more visible. The cannon shells were painted X31 titanium gold before I cut out and cleaned up the nose piece and assembled the jet engine intake section. To make the insides more visible, I decided to move the wing root parts and glue them to the wall of the wing halves after cutting away the excess plastic so that they would fit. The rear exhausts were assembled and then glued to the inside of the upper fuselage area, and to add some extra wiring details, I got some thin metal wire from some jewellery making sets and bent or twisted several sections and then painted them a mix of flat white and flat yellow. I then painted the inside of the nose section and landing gear and weapon bay doors with XF24 and the struts of the undercarriage XF22 while they were on the sprue. I applied several coats until the colours were solid before then using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to attach the wires to the inside of the fuselage and around the instrument panel. I also glued some wiring going around the engine intakes since these would be visible from the cockpit. The tyres were carefully painted Vallejo flat black and then set aside to dry while I addressed a slight issue with the exhausts. As you can see, you could clearly see through inside of the fuselage through the exhausts, so to fix this, I cut out two pieces of polystyrene, bent them to a semicircle, and then painted them oily steel to create the inside of the exhausts. Some excess plastic was trimmed off the fuselage parts to help fit the wing details in, and with the flat black on the tyres dry at this stage, I added some Tamiya X1 gloss black to paint the hubs. After some more coats of oily steel, I finally glued the polystyrene pieces into place and painted another coat of X1 on the hubs. To highlight the various interior details, I used some Tamiya black panel liner scent and applied it onto the various internal details, and once it had dried I removed the excess with some X20 enamel thinners, which also helps the panel liner to flow more into the recessed details, further highlighting them. The inside of the exhausts were painted flat black to help hide them, and after another coat for the tyres, I finally glued the upper and lower fuselage halves together and glued the nose to the front. Once the nose was in place, I then added the wing halves by sliding them into place. I used some Tamiya extra thin cement to help join the gaps, and once dry I sanded the joints with several different grades of sandpaper and then filled any gaps that remained between the wings, nose and fuselage with some Vallejo water-based putty. The main landing gear was then assembled, which was a bit fiddly, but overall it fitted together quite nicely. The landing gear bay also required an additional coat of XF24 dark grey, so I painted it and while it dried assembled the massive nose wheel. To add to the what if factor, I decided to 3D print some X4 air-to-air missiles, which were made by Raz Debat Designs, which I downloaded for free from his Cult page, a link to which I will leave in the description. Although I believe the X4's complex guidance system meant it was only planned to be used in two-seater aircraft, such as some variants of the ME-262, I decided why not, for something different and to add an interesting talking point to this model. To add the pylons for the X4s, I carefully measured both sides so they would line up evenly and marked their positions with a needle, before then using a scriber and a file to create a slot to glue the pylons into. I probably could have mounted the pylons a bit closer to the fuselage or the centre of the wings, but I'm still happy enough with where they're positioned. The raised wiring details in the main wheel well was painted flat yellow, before the main wheels were then glued into place along with their struts. The nose wheel had a much more complex set of struts and systems which had to be installed, and were rather delicate and tricky to line up, but with a bit of patience and much fiddling I did manage to get them into place. The weapon bay doors were cut out and cleaned up, though I planned to not glue them so I could still access the weapons bay when the model was completed. I decided to go for a late war what if scheme, starting off with 4 coats of AK Interactive's RLM 76 late war version. Unfortunately, I lost the clip of me applying the first coat, but as you can see I mixed the paint with a bit of water to thin it down and then apply it as much as possible in the same direction air would flow over the aircraft. So nose to, well, tail. That phrase works better on more conventional aircraft, admittedly. I also painted a large section of the leading edge of the wing with RLM 76 on the upper surface. After the 4th coat had dried, I applied 2 coats of RLM 82 in a similar fashion on the upper surface, occasionally changing directions so I wouldn't accidentally overpaint the RLM 76 on the leading edges of the wings, but I did paint over the nose and engine sections in the same direction. My plan was to add a mottled effect on the leading edges of the wing that would sort of fade to the made camouflage area on the upper surfaces. A 5th coat of RLM 76 was added, followed by a 3rd coat of RLM 82 to make these colours strong and uniform, and then I got out the 3rd and darkest colour which I would use in the form of RLM 81 version 3. This dark brown colour was used to create the outlines of a sharp-edged camouflage, and then I used it to fill in the shapes, keeping the paint thin enough that it would be slightly transparent, but thick enough so that it wouldn't run too much. Once the main camouflage was completed, I then started to apply lots of small random shapes with the RLM 81 on the leading edges of the wing near the camouflage shapes so that it looked like a faded continuation of the brown camouflage areas. The camouflage received a 2nd coat of RLM 81, and then I applied a 4th coat of RLM 82 and repeated the mottling shape process on the empty areas of the leading edges of the wing with the RLM 82. Once I was happy with my mottled shapes, I then applied a thin coat of RLM 76 on the leading edges of the wing, especially at the very front, and I applied a 6th coat of the RLM 76 on the underside. I continued to add the RLM 76, but in the end I found it faded the colours a little bit too strongly, so I ended up applying another coat of the modelling colours with a finer brush to make some of the shapes a little bit stronger. To add to the late war effect, I decided to paint some RLM 76 version 1 onto the flaps and ailerons, and I used some RLM 74 and 75 to paint the upper surface of the ailerons with a different camouflage colour and pattern, as though they'd been from a spare aircraft, or perhaps made in a different factory, as was common with late war German aircraft. On the nose and wingtips, I added several coats of Vallejo flat yellow to create the yellow identification markings, and I decided to make my Horten 229 from JG7, so I painted the Defense of the Reich marks on the rear first using 70963 medium blue, and after I'd applied a second coat of yellow and the blue was dry, I applied the red stripe with vermilion red. The ID bands would receive several layers until their colours were strong and uniform, and once I'd fixed up any mistakes I'd made with a fine brush, I painted the cockpit area and any parts of the landing bay I had accidentally painted over with some XF24 dark grey. The aircraft then received a coat of Vallejo's water-based gloss varnish to prepare it for decals and to help protect the paint job. Unfortunately, my brush seemed to have a few loose bristles, which I didn't catch at the time, which left a few black hairs on the underside, but usually I have very little issues with brush painting the Vallejo varnishes. After leaving the varnish for a day to dry, I then cut out the decals into some manageable sections, and after sticking them in some warm, clean water, I then applied water onto the model and then slid the decals into their position. The level of detail on the decals was really great, although they definitely required the gloss varnish to stop them silvering, and the walkway marking with a large amount of its transparencies was a little bit of a pain. In hindsight, I probably should have trimmed it so that I just had the edge markings, rather than applying the entire decal with its clear film. Once in place, I applied some Vallejo decal softener, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive, over the top of them to help them conform to the model and show any surface detail that would be underneath them. I left the model to dry overnight and continued to paint the landing gear doors, and I also painted the framework for the canopy with some Vallejo German grey to create the inside colour. I ended up printing 3 of the X-4 missiles so that I would have a spare, and these were painted first with some Vallejo 70854 natural steel for their body, followed by Vallejo Air RLM01 silver for the nose tip, Vallejo 70873 US field drab as a base colour for the wooden stabiliser fins, Vallejo 70997 silver for the middle section, Vallejo flat white for the pointed nose tip, and some Vallejo flat black for the nose cone, and the small tips which would have held the flares and the control cables on the fins. 2 coats of these colours were applied before I used the dark and natural wood grain paints to add some texture onto the fins, and then I returned to the plane, applying a coat of Vallejo water-based matte varnish over the entire model to help protect the decals and give it a uniform finish to blend everything together. The missiles received some touch-ups, and after the matte varnish had 12 hours to dry, I then painted the panels behind the exhausts with a few coats of watered-down Vallejo oily steel. The struts for the wheels were painted RLM01 silver, and the canopy received a base of RLM82 for the exterior. At this point, I noticed I'd lost the left wheel strut, and since I couldn't find it, I ended up measuring the right one and designing and 3D printing a replacement. While the spare struts printed, I weathered the model first by using some Tamiya XF52 flat earth to create some wooden chipping on some of the sections of the aircraft. The wooden chipping was mainly applied on the leading edges of the wings, around all the access hatches and recess details, and quite heavily on the walkway area since these spots are more vulnerable to receiving paint damage. XF59 Desert Yellow was then also dabbed over the flat earth chips to add some lighter variation, adding to the wooden grainy effect. XF16 flat aluminium was applied to the access hatches, the landing gear doors, and other metal areas around the walkway and engine covers to add a little bit of metal chipping. The chipping was then softened and given a subtle layered effect by painting over some small sections of it using the camouflage colours. This also creates a bit of a distressed look near some of the chips, which in my opinion helps to make the chipping more realistic. To then highlight the recess details and add some post shading, I applied some Tamiya black panel liner scent along all of the recess panels, access hatches, and the control surfaces. Once it had dried, I then used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to help remove the excess from any areas I didn't want it, and to soften the effect until I had a more subtle post-shading and weathered effect. In some areas, I also used a brush with the enamel thinners to help remove the excess and get it to flow more into the areas with a lot of small and tight details. I used the Black Tamiya Weathering Master Powder pigments to build up some burnt soot effects along the engine exhaust area and around the ejector shell port and cannons. I also streak the black powders backwards from the control hinges and the landing gear to create some grime streaks. The excess weathering powder is then removed and the effect softened using a damp cotton bud dipped in some water. At this stage, I then cut out the canopy sections and glued the missiles to their pylons and the front canopy section with some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. This glue is really good for both resin parts and also canopies, as it dries clear and doesn't fog anything up, while also being a little bit more flexible but still quite strong like super glue. I decided to try and create the control wires leading from the two missile fin tips to the pylons using some AK Interactive mega thin rubber wire and some super glue. This was an incredibly fiddly process and possibly not worth the effort, but I thought it was cool and a bit of a unique feature about the missiles which I wanted to try and capture. The finer parts that had been left off the model were cut out and glued into place, and I painted the RLM 81 version 3 onto the canopy to continue the camouflage pattern onto it. RLM 76 Late War was used to paint the pitot tube, while XF52 Flat Earth was used to paint the wooden antenna on the underside of the aircraft, and the cannons were painted Vallejo Air Gunmetal Metallic. The tips of the pitot tube and aerial were then painted RLM 01 Silver, and I added some of the wooden grain paints to the antenna on the underside. After the canopy had been given a second coat, I removed any excess paints with a cocktail stick, and to improve the canopy's clarity and shininess, I used a fine brush to apply some Deluxe Materials Looks Like Glass onto all of the clear parts. This seemed to really make a big difference and improve the clarity of these rather distorted and curved canopy sections. Off camera, I gave the wheel doors a coat of gloss varnish, and then I applied their decals, and once those were in position, I cut them out of the sprue and glued them onto the model. The resin replacement wheel struts were glued onto the model as well, and then the wheel doors received a coat of matte varnish. Some final touch-ups were done to the wheel struts, landing gear doors, and landing gear, and I also added some black weathering powder to the cannon barrels to create some gun smoke. After the flat black and gloss black on the wheels was dry, I then dusted them lightly with a coat of some sand pigment to add a little bit of extra weathering. Finally, I gave the landing gear a coat of black panel liner scent to highlight their details and add some grime, and after I painted the navigation lights on the wingtips with a base coat of RLM1 Silver and a top coat of either XF27 or XF26 clear red and green, the Revell Horten 229 was finally completed. And here you can see the results I was able to achieve with this model. So starting off with the negative points, this is definitely a rather fiddly kit in some areas, especially the landing gear, and the wings and fuselage required some convincing to join. I also probably could have gotten a much better result for using an airbrush for a better paint job, a more subtle mottling effect, and I could have also avoided the brush hairs getting stuck with the varnish, but I am looking into an airbrush setup at some point, though at the moment it's just a question of money and, more importantly, enough space to have both a booth and a decent setup. Despite this though, I'm still really happy with the results I achieved using a brush, and I'm very happy with how both my weathering and detailing turned out, as well as how well the Deluxe Materials Looks Like Glass seems to have improved the scratches and distortions on the canopy. Most importantly to me though, I had a lot of fun doing a bit of a different what if project, and although I missed the deadline for the group build, I'm still really happy I went ahead with this project. I was very surprised with how detailed and well moulded this kit is, considering it's a Revell tooling and one from the mid-90s at that. So in conclusion, I would definitely recommend this kit if you're interested in a Luftwaffe 1946 what if project, as it has some great details, decent enough decals which definitely require some gloss varnish, and is still both a fun and unique kit to make in 1/72nd scale. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And if you have any requests for what you want me to see build next, or any helpful advice on how I can help improve building my models, then please leave it down in the comment section below. Big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying the kits, but also all of the products I use when I make them. Next week is probably going to be a build video on a tank kit, and I also plan to have another inbox review. Otherwise though, plenty of projects and stop motions in the works, so stay tuned for more updates and videos. And of course, as always, take care, and until the next video, model on.